Today I'm in Bushwick in Brooklyn, in what was once known as Ridgewood Park in Queens. And I want to do a little quick story for you that was set back in 1886. Now this area right here, where the camera's pointing, that used to be a baseball stadium known as Ridgewood Park. And in the summer of 1886, the world heavyweight boxing champion, John L. Sullivan, came to fight at Ridgewood Park in Queens. Now these were the days before boxing was legalized, so they had to work with local authorities to try and get a license and, you know, maybe pay some people off. But John L. Sullivan came here to fight a guy by the name of Frank Harold. Now in papers of the time, the guy's name is spelled H-E-A-R-L-D, Frank Harold, but in later days it's spelled as Harold, so not 100% sure what the exact name is. Now, Brooklyn at the time was a city, it wasn't part of New York, and the border between Queens and Brooklyn is right where that car is right now, down at that intersection, and that's important for the story. Now newspaper reports of the time said that they Newspaper reports of the time stated that the Queens Police Department didn't have enough people to man a 5,000 person crowd, and I think the crowd ended up being around 6,000. So that's why they decided the fight would take place here, because they wasn't going to be interrupted, because boxing was illegal back then. However, on the day of the fight, John L. Sullivan and Frank Harold showed up at the baseball stadium here, and the authorities decided that they were going to close it down. So the actual fight between John L. Sullivan and Frank Harold wasn't going to take place. However, and this is why I said this part was important, somebody who was at the baseball stadium that day said to John L. Sullivan and their camp, and Frank Harold and his camp, that a section of the stadium was actually in Brooklyn. So they got together with the fighters. Now, back in 1886, this area to the right here was a grandstand, and the baseball stadium still extended into this road right here. In fact, home plate would have been where the traffic light is down there, because the grandstand was in left field. So when they told John L. Sullivan and Frank Harold that part of the stadium was actually in Brooklyn, they agreed to move the fight from here, from where the main part of the stadium was, down to the Brooklyn side of the stadium. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to go to the end of the road, and then we're going to carry on the story from the Brooklyn side of the stadium. So I've just come from where that car is right now, which was the main hub of Ridgewood Park. And like I said, to the side here, this was a grandstand. Now at the time, this was Ridgewood in Queens, which is, we're now in Brooklyn. And back in the 1880s, the Brooklyn City line, and remember Brooklyn was a city back then, and not a borough of New York, And this is signified by a map in the early 1900s. The Brooklyn City line actually crossed over right here on this corner. So, like I said, this part here was still the grandstand, so that would have gone back like maybe halfway down this block as well. So the city line would have been like, say where it says office right there, and it would have gone diagonally across this road right here, across the corner, so that section right there would have been Brooklyn as well. Now, the stadium at the time, the fence, was on the other side of Irving. So all of this area here would have been the Brooklyn section of the ballpark. So it didn't take long to work out that the area where John L. Sullivan and Frank Hurd were going to fight was literally right here, right at this intersection. I find that quite exciting, because like I said, the grandstand would have gone back, so that part would have been really obsolete. The fencing went up to the other side of Irving Street, so this area here was still part of the ballpark. But there wouldn't have been much room here for the Brooklyn side of the ballpark, although that still would have been Brooklyn at the time. But this would have been the main hub of Brooklyn at Ridgewood Park. Now the unfortunate part is when the fighters came here, some like male Karen of the day told both fighters, and remember boxing was illegal back then because it was bare-knuckle boxing, even though the two fighters had agreed to fight under Queensberry rules. And what they said was it was going to be 6 rounds for points only. However, somebody went to the fighters and said if they went ahead and fought right here in Brooklyn, that he was going to go and get the police commissioner of Brooklyn and they were going to arrest a lot of them. So the fight didn't happen right here as was planned, even though John L. Sullivan was here for the fight. Now here's a little interesting part as well. What they decided was they couldn't fight here. And as you can imagine, both fighters were probably pretty upset by this point they couldn't fight. They got the wealthiest patrons who were in attendance that day, and they all put up what would have been a substantial amount at the time. I don't know exactly what that was. But about 300 of the patrons that day all grouped together, and there was a guy who owned this big estate here in New York. So what the legend is, and there's no proof of this, the legend is that the fighters left this stadium and then went and fought on private property. Now whether that happened or not, I don't know, because when was it? 2 weeks after this proposed fight here, the two fighters, John L. Sullivan and Frank Hurd, they actually fought in Philadelphia. The fight was scheduled to take place here in August of 1886. And they ended up fighting in in September of 1886 in Philadelphia. Now, I haven't been able to get full newspaper reports of that fight yet. I do subscribe to a newspaper archive. But the fight finished after 2 rounds, and by all accounts, the police stopped the fight. Now, the whys and wherefores of that, I don't know. Anyway, Anyway, I thought that would be a nice little story about the time that John L. Sullivan, the world heavyweight boxing champion of the world, came here to fight in Ridgewood, Queens.